Okay, so now we're going to look at evidence of ancient giants in North America. This is a book I've written with my co-author Jim Vieira called Giants on Record, and we've been researching giants for many years. It's a bit of a strange subject. It's all over the internet. There's lots of photos of giants everywhere you look. Here are some that have been found all over the internet. It's even in various blogs and books and other lectures by various researchers. However, every single image you see here is actually a hoax. And many of these were created in a Photoshop competition from 2002 and have appeared everywhere since then. However, this has become a problem when looking at the serious research on actual giant human beings existing around the world. Today, we're going to focus on North America. Here's a graphic we put together demonstrating the size range of what we've been looking at, some of the accounts that we've uncovered on the North American area. This is 6 foot down here, and we have ranges going up from 7 foot all the way to 18 feet. Now, many of these accounts were actually recorded in academic journals, in scientific papers, even on display at universities and colleges. But one of the main sources we look at is the newspaper record, as well as town and county histories, other academic sources, doctors' notes, and also people who had discovered them over the centuries of building and exploring through North America. This is a map that was put together by Cecilia Hall, a friend of ours. This is before we got the full amount of accounts. We didn't put every single one on here because it would have been just a purple blur, because there's so many, especially here. This is the kind of peak area where these giants would have existed. So what we're looking at here, we're looking at a timeline as well of various different races of giants existing in North America. For example, in the southwest and over on the Channel Islands, Catalina Island, we find evidence of human occupation going back between 40 and 10,000 years ago. We get very ancient shell and midden mounds up the coast of California, and also down in Florida, we have also very ancient midden and shell mounds, as well as red-haired giants in this area and around this area, which we'll have a look at later, specifically around the area of Nevada. The main area here is the Mound culture area, which would have been the Adena people, also the Mississippian culture, the Hopewell, and others, starting really about 3000 BC onwards with the very, very early Adena, or the archaic culture of that area. We also have evidence up in New England and New York. And this is interesting because there's megalithic sites up in that area. But we're going to start our survey by going much further south. And we're going to have a look at Patagonia, the southern tip of South America. And we're going to head back up north. Now, the reason this is intriguing, because many of the explorers who were traveling around the world in the 1500s onwards and sailing around the coasts of the Americas actually witnessed very, very tall giants existing in Terra del Fuego, the southern tip of Chile and Argentina, also over to the Onas Islands and also into Antarctica. Ferdinand Magellan, even Sir Francis Drake, which we'll look at in a moment. But even in 1901, they were still being reported. And this is Captain Frederick Cook, who actually photographed himself with some giants down on the Onas Islands around this area here. This was actually the route he took. So even from up to 1901, from the 1500s, this is Sir Francis Drake, who witnessed some himself in 1578. We have many, many accounts between 7 and 10 feet tall found in this part of the world. And this really triggered a wave of Giantology in the 1500s and early 1600s that even appeared in books that were coming out in Britain at the time. And even some local Native American peoples were being kidnapped and being tried to bring them back to Europe. Obviously some of that failed and they died on the journey. But this just shows you the world encompassed. This is the book that was eventually released from the book by Sir Francis Drake's nephew, talking about his journeys around the Americas. He even went up to the Californian coast, up to the area possibly around San Francisco, where he met some giants when he came inland. He had to repair his boats, he had to collect supplies, and they were so chaotic and unruly that they tried to crown him chief of their tribe, which would have been quite an interesting experience. We have other accounts of early explorers witnessing them firsthand. These include Alonso Alvarez de Pineda in 1519, and he describes them as a race of giants from 10 to 11 palms in height, which would have been anywhere from 7 foot to 8 feet tall. And he also described a race of pygmies or dwarfs who were living with the giants. Other accounts, even in the Caribbean, this was written by historian Peter Martyr, and this is quite strange. It describes how he thought giants were created. And he said, the report ran that the natives were white and their king and queen's giants, whose bones, while babies, had been softened with an ointment of strange herbs, then kneaded and stretched like wax by masters of the art, leaving the poor objects of their magic half dead, until after repeated manipulations they finally attained their great size. So this appears to be a way you can become a giant. There are many, many other explorers which we feature in the book Giants on Record. We have the White Indians of Duher, which were reported in 1521. There was Chicora giants that were captured. 70 of them were taken back or tried to take back to Europe. In 1528, we had Panfilo de Narvaez, who witnessed giants in the area of Tampa Bay in Florida, describing them as very, very tall. Later, 7 to 8 foot giants were discovered in this area. And the stories go on with these explorers. Francisco Coronado, witnessed several tribes of giants. Hernando de Alcaron brought back with him a Native American so large and tall that the best man in his army reached only to his chest. And we have Hernando de Soto, who triggered the brilliant story about Tuscaloosa, and an all-out war was triggered when they tried to kidnap him. And he was said to be over 8 feet tall. We also have the Susquehannocks. This is the area around Virginia, and this is a picture of one of the giants that was witnessed by Captain John Smith. There are multiple other stories that kind of fit with the idea that giants were indeed witnessed over and over again, right up until the early 1900s. And in the book, we have an entire chapter devoted to even presidents of the United States who met some of these giants. New England is an area that Jim Vieira lives. I've been researching up there for some time. This just shows you the tribal areas of New England as it was recorded in the late early 1600s. And this is a map of where some notable giant accounts have been unearthed, notably up here in Deerfield, where the area where Jim began his research. But we did some research up there. Jim came across George Sheldon's amazing town history of Deerfield, where it describes giant skeletons and bones all around the area. And even on Martha's Vineyard, we have a dolmen, which are often associated with giants in Britain and Europe, found on one of these islands where giants were unearthed. And then we have the amazing Pascoe. He was a powerful shaman of the Pennacook tribe in the area of New Hampshire. And in the 1600s, he brought together all the tribal peoples together to fight the aggressive Mohawk nation. He was said to be nearly 8 feet tall. He lived right next to an area where, in fact, there's now a stone circle, or a stone arrangement at least, called Druids Hill Stone Circle. And this could have been part of their culture back in the early 1600s, because it was reported in 1659 that this did indeed exist in this area. We have numerous accounts. We have Connecticut here from 1901. Giants were uncovered, many different bones. Even a petrified giant over 8 feet tall was reported in 1897. We go into detail in the book about all these different accounts. If we head over towards New York and Pennsylvania, we have certain accounts which were reported by academics, and we're going to look at some of the accounts here from an academic viewpoint, because Most of the bones, as we know, have been disappeared by the Smithsonian and also by NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, where the bones and burial goods and skeletons and so forth are taken back and repatriated and reburied by the local tribes. This was excavation by archaeologist D.S. Fisher. 49 skeletons were unearthed in Washington County, Pennsylvania. Some of them were nearly 8 feet high, which is quite remarkable, and 26 inches across the chest. Here we have him examining huge bones and very large teeth, and it was witnessed by various different people, even though you can't see it very clearly in this picture, and reported in academic journals. There's various accounts in New York State. Now, New York State is interesting because it's one of the areas in the eastern side has megalithic constructions, and on the western side it has mounds all over the landscape there. Norman Brokenshire, he's done some excellent research of this area. He's found 28-pound sledgehammers, reports of them, and also large swords were found, suggesting this whole area was inhabited by giants. Skeletons were found, in this account, one of extraordinary size. The skull was comparatively large, and the jaw was so large it could be placed around the jaw of a normal human being. And this is one of the accounts we're going to look at that had double rows of teeth, an anatomic anomaly associated with these giants. And it continues in 1854. We have other accounts of double teeth in each jaw with a very large sized skeleton. And it continues. This one, it talks about entire double rows of teeth. And this is an account from Cattaraugus County, New York, where the gentleman Charles Huntington claims he was present when he was young of skeletons unearthed in 1876, which were 9 foot and 7 foot tall, a male and a female. And he created these in honor of the discoveries that were made in his childhood. But the main area of the giants, really, and we're going to look at here is this area here, the Ohio Valley, and also drifting into West Virginia as well. But Ohio is the richest area of giants, really. We really have to admit that. The best researcher we've come across, we've worked with him now, is Ross Hamilton, that we call him the godfather of Giantology. And he's also a researcher of Serpent Mound in Peebles, Ohio. This is a very, very interesting earthwork site. It's 1,370 feet long, and it's built in at least about 300 BC. And you can see it's a plumed serpent with slight kind of wings, if you like, coming off the neck of the serpent, which is an ancient tradition we find all over the Americas and even around the world. But just prior to 1891, Professor Frederick Ward Putnam of Harvard University, he was a biologist and anthropologist, he opened one of the burial mounds on the property of the Great Serpent Mound, and it suggested that this photo was actually from there. This is actually a postcard that was available in the early 1900s, talking about a 7-foot skeleton of mound builder, 7 foot in length, Serpent Mound. And it's thought he must have been the one who excavated it, because he was the only person who actually excavated this area. We have other accounts from Serpent Mound now, which is going to be published soon by Jeffrey Wilson, who lives in this area. And he's gone deep into the archives and found evidence of potentially an over 9-foot skeleton being found within the mounds at Serpent Mound. Now, even though the dating of Serpent Mound is only around 300 BC, officially at the very earliest, one of the mounds there, which these apparently came from, is labelled an Adena mound, which would have been much earlier. And so we know there's more archaic activity in this area than is admitted by archaeologists and academics. Marietta is also another very interesting mound. It's said to be a Hopewell site. It's a complex, really, of squares and small pyramid-like earthen structures with a large mound at one end, which kind of sort of marks the sacred spot of the area. Interestingly, in 1901, a skeleton of abnormal size, over 7 feet tall, was discovered in one of the earthworks. You can see the shape and the geometry, and these are very similar to what we find, the kind of pyramids we find in Central America. This is an interesting account from Indiana. from 1903 from Anderson Intelligentsia, and the title is Grew in Spite of Age. And this is very interesting because it's one of several reports really that speak of an enormous skeleton being buried with corn, and then when planted it was taken out of the burial, and this was like 60 feet below the surface or more. They then planted this corn and actually grew corn, and it became this really powerful, really strong crop, which was then used and spread out through the area. So even though this is possibly hundreds or even thousands of years old, it proves that they were working with agriculture, and they may have had fertility technologies working with the ancient energies of the earth, which we described in one of the other lectures we've done in this series. In West Virginia, it's a very, very interesting area for giants. The whole Kanawha Valley, we've got Charleston, the Great Smith Mound, and many other areas going all the way over to Washington, D.C. And to Virginia. Grave Creek Mound is one of the most important, which we'll look at in a moment. In 1906, a report from the Maryland Academy of Scientists talk about a skeleton over 8 feet tall that was discovered. It was actually in a good state of preservation, and it was actually on display there as well. And so we have an academic institution with an 8-foot skeleton potentially on display. Where it is now, we don't know, probably taken away by NAGPRA. But it proves that even in the academic record, we have very interesting accounts. In 1959, the brilliant Donald Dragoo, Dr. Donald Dragoo, he was the curator of the section of man at the Carnegie Museum, and he unearthed a 7'2" skeleton during an excavation, or really an obliteration, of the Crescent Mound in northwest Virginia, not too far, just a few miles away from Grave Creek Mound. And this is where he started describing the Edina jaw, which is this huge, powerful jaw, which was found in many of the accounts, especially in the mound culture sites. And it was reported they were so large you could place them over your face, or the largest man in the village's face. And we have many, many accounts of this, and we do a whole section in the book about this. There's also unusually thick skulls he discovered, robust and massive frames indicating profound muscularity, which suggests this wasn't just a case of acromegaly, this was actually a case of giant human beings existing in this part of North America. This is actually an actual photo of the 7'2" skeleton with a burnt head and burnt upper portion of the body, torso in the mound. And he published this, he wrote about this, but it pretty much got ignored and eventually suppressed. And this is the case we find with many of these stories. This is the famous Grave Creek Mound, 70 feet tall, it's one of the largest in America. 295 feet in diameter, 60,000 tons of earth were used to create this. There's a complex of mounds, octagonal earthwork, stone towers up on the bluffs, and other pieces of this great complex spreading around the area. There were various interpretations and observations about what was actually discovered here, but we kind of concluded in the book, we couldn't fully conclude it because there's different stories about different people who claim to have existed when this was being excavated, but somewhere between 7 and 8 foot tall skeletons were found in this mound, along with this, which is the Grave Creek tablet, or the Grave Creek stone. It's only a few centimeters wide, but it's so important because when Barry Fell, who was a Harvard epigrapher, he pronounced actually that this was Punic or Phoenician or even Canaanite. So we're talking about extremely ancient writing, which is related to the Bible lands being found in a mound with giants in North America. And this should have been a breakthrough. This should have been a big story. It should have exploded and really connected what was going on in the ancient world, but it got lost. It got disappeared, and eventually the story got suppressed and forgotten. In Kentucky, there's various accounts here which are very interesting. We have the Dover Mound, which we're going to look at, but there are many other ones as well we feature in the book. The Dover Mound, there's a book written about it by William Snyder Webb and Charles Ernest Snow that came out in 1959, and they discovered a 7-foot skeleton here during excavations in 1952. And like the Don Dragoo report, this account occurs in the 50s and also by very highly respected academic individuals. Now, this is something which has not been really recognised and expanded upon by researchers. So I'm trying to sort of point out that even the academics were dealing with this. They were describing these features of these giants. This is also found in northern Kentucky. This is actually on display now in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. It's a very strange museum. This shows you the size of it. It's 7'6", and I looked into this, and the report stated that this was indeed found in northern Kentucky, and it was found by the owner, who gave it to the museum but said, look, you can't say where this came from, you can't say where I found this, and so there's like a blank as to where it was actually found. So if it was found in the Mound, which it may have been, and it could have been the reason why he refused to give the information, because it's an illegal dig, this could actually be the only skeleton currently on display in North America of one of the giant mound builders. We have various other stories, various other areas around America. For example, Moundville in Alabama. In 1930, it was reported that a 7'6" skeleton was unearthed. And there was an excavator, or Dr. Walter B. Jones, who led the excavation. And he wrote about this. And there's different people followed up on this, but it kind of got closed down. They were even on display in a kind of on-site museum, which is featured on this postcard here. And that obviously got closed down by NAGPRA and so forth. But various researches were done. Jim contacted the people here, and they claimed they knew nothing about it, and there was nothing written about it, but it was actually in the academic reports, again, of over 7 foot tall skeletons. This just shows you one of the beautiful stone artifacts that was actually found at this site. So you can see there's a very high level of sophistication, not only with the artifacts, but also with the construction of these mounds. Very geometric, astronomically aligned, and working with the natural earth energies and telluric currents. Even down in Florida, we have many, many accounts down here. Amelia Island's a very interesting one. There's an account from 1914. Burial mound of giant race holds secrets, thighs and skulls sent to the Smithsonian, which is something we find a lot with these accounts. Professor J.H. Pratt of the Southland Seminary reports finding bones of a 9-foot skeleton. He describes and emphasizes the extraordinary size of some of the skulls dug up. He also worked for the University of North Carolina and wrote about the mineralogy of the state. So this guy wasn't some random idiot kind of digging things up. He was a professor. He was working on mineralogy, and he was describing and measuring what he saw. And claims by skeptics claim they just make mistakes, they can't measure things properly. And I believe gentlemen like this could measure things properly. Even in Texas, we have various accounts from academics. This is from 1940 in Victoria County. A year earlier, a skull was unearthed that was believed to be the largest skull in the world. It was twice the size of a normal human cranium. Other human bones of large size were unearthed. Marcus S. Goldstein, the physical anthropologist in charge of the find, was formerly an aide to Dr. Ales Hadlichka of the Smithsonian, who we'll be talking about shortly. So we're having a look here, we're talking about twice the skull of a normal man. We're looking at between 36 to 40 inch circumference skull. You can see they were even photographed. So we're looking into this to see if these are still somewhere in the archive, because if they are, this is very good evidence of giants in North America. We can also look at some of the artifacts that were found around North America. Here's Jim holding an axe head that was discovered, or really, acquired by our good friend Brock Smith, who's based in Mississippi. There's me with a smaller one here. This is 14.5 pounds. This one is 33 pounds, discovered in an Illinois mound, not too far from Cahokia. Now, if you were to wield one of these, you would have to probably be 8 foot tall just to even hold it and use it as an axe. And these are not necessarily ceremonial, because when we inspected this, we found markings on it, and we created a video, a very thorough investigative video about this, which you can watch on the Megalithomania YouTube channel. There are other accounts. This one is, again, 33 pounds, 10 ounces. It was found in Kansas City, Missouri. reported in the early 1900s. But the double rows of teeth, I mean, we do have many more accounts of artifacts we feature in the book and in the video, so you can watch if you want more details. But the double rows of teeth is a phenomena we keep coming across in our research. Very bizarre case of either hypodontia or extra rows of teeth, sometimes just extra teeth. In Amelia Island, Florida, this is reported in the Smithsonian records, a third row of teeth was found in a 7-foot tall skeleton before the skeleton crumbled to dust. We have numerous accounts. We have an entire chapter devoted to the fact that many of the accounts, we're talking from all across North America, from New England all the way down to South California and Catalina Island and so forth, where these double rows of teeth. And you can just see a couple of examples here. Double teeth in the front as well as in the back part of the jaw. This is from Ohio. In Minnesota, the teeth were still sound and double all around, and so on and so forth. An 8-foot skeleton with front as well as in the back of the mouth and in both the upper and lower jaws, double teeth, and so on and so forth. Now, skeptics have looked at this and claimed that this doesn't really, doesn't make sense. It could be the parlance or the way people spoke at the time. But there's too many accounts, and some of them clearly describe 2 rows of teeth in one jaw. So we feel it's a reality, and we feel this is a kind of genetic throwback of the giants. And we talked to a dental anthropologist, Shara Bailey of New York University, and she was astonished when we showed her these accounts when we were filming for the Search for the Lost Giants TV show that came out on History Channel. And she had noted a few accounts of hypodontia, or extra teeth in skulls, but not full double rows of teeth. But we have accounts going back into the Bible and the early traditions in the Middle East, which talk about this as well. Other strange anomalies, we have cranial deformation. There are some accounts where there are baby skulls that are deformed. These are from the Chinook tribe and the Flathead tribe, is an appropriate name. This one is actually from Bolivia, near Pumapunku. It's actually gone missing, got stolen, this one. But this is a tradition we find all over North America, mainly in South and Central America, but also in North America, and they're often associated with the giants, like a tradition that was passed on from culture to culture. One of my favourite subjects, and Jim's least favourite, is horned skulls. This is apparently a photo from 1916 from Tioga Point, Pennsylvania. Again, there was some excavations done at a place called Sayre in Pennsylvania. There were some mounds there, and this photo became associated with it in the early 70s, even though the excavation was something like 50 or 80 years earlier. But this is actually, we believe, is probably a fake. It's now in this special museum, which we spoke to the curator and he was unsure about it. But we do have various accounts of horned skulls, and it does happen. It is a phenomenon that still happens, and occasionally they're associated with giants. Catalina Island is a very interesting area, and all the Channel Islands off the coast of Southern California. We have Catalina here, and all these islands really have some kind of giant accounts associated with them. Interestingly, not only giant skeletons reported, but even a stone circle was reported, and evidence and descriptions of red-haired and ruddy-skinned Native Americans living on these islands. There's even evidence of occupation going back 40,000 years. And this is intriguing, and this was researched by a very controversial amateur archaeologist called Ralph Glidden. And he eventually created this bizarre museum on Catalina Island in the 1920s onwards. But it was first really reported on in 1913 by a German naturalist who started looking into skeletons and other such things that were being found on the island. And this is him here. This is Dr. A.W. Furstenan, who reported unearthing an 8-foot tall skeleton in 1913. This was later worked on, as we said, by Ralph Glidden, who eventually discovered and unearthed something like 3,781 skeletons between 1919 and 1930. He was involved with the Hay Foundation of New York, and he even claimed to have unearthed a 9'2" skeleton, several measuring over 7 feet tall. Now, Jim Vieira and Bill Vieira went to investigate this as part of the TV show and found more evidence basically evidence to back up what he was saying, and even evidence of bones on other islands, suggesting there were indeed giants roaming this part of the world. In March 2012, the curator John Baragina, who was the curator of the museum on the island, found lost records. This is what Jim and Bill were looking through to find more evidence. And there's even evidence of cranial deformation, which has been noted by researchers such as our good friend L.A. Mazzulli, who came up with this graphic. And he found that he looked at this photo, did some analysis on it, and believes he's found a giant who could be 8 foot 6 inches tall, this one lying here, when all the measurements were worked out. Even on San Nicolas Island, one of the other islands of the Channel Islands, we have various accounts. This one is actually from Mr. Longfellow, which is an appropriate name. And he describes giant jaw bones, very large skeletons, and some were almost giants. So we have this going on here on the different islands. We even have double rows of teeth mentioned on other islands here, and this was reported by the Scientific American. And so some of the different islands get a mention here that there was stuff going on, and it's very, very intriguing. And it's not really being researched, it's not being followed up, it's not being put out there properly. But when you have the Scientific American revealing giants with double rows of teeth, it is really quite astonishing. So this is a little bit later. This is from Santa Barbara from 1959, and they believe these date to 7,070 years old. This is an Indian cemetery, they call it, on Santa Rosa Island, but the carbon dating has created some very, very interesting ideas about what was going on here. It was developed and worked on by Phil Orr of the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. And over 13 years of work, he discovered some skeletons. These were some of the ones involved. One of them was called Arlington Spring skeleton, which was, they believed it was a male, then a female, and then a male, etc. But the interesting thing is, it was 13,000 years old. And so we're finding extremely ancient evidence on these islands, pushing the history of North America back and linking it with very early accounts of giants. The Smithsonian were inevitably involved in many of these accounts, and some people say they were actually responsible for disappearing many of these bones. It's a remarkable story which we feature in the book. We're not going to go into it in too much detail here, but I've been to the Smithsonian. I went there in 2012 to investigate, but many of the accounts we came across, I mean literally hundreds of them I believe, were based upon the fact that the Smithsonian would go and collect the skeletons when they were discovered by individuals on their land, or they were sent to the Smithsonian for them to investigate and put in their archives. But when the Smithsonian were then asked, well, where are the bones? They go, oh, we don't know anything about that. And they would all be disappeared. And obviously this was the main academic institution of North America at the time. So it's unfortunate that they are involved in the disappearing of such bones. But actual accounts there were actually several accounts in the 5th and 12th annual report of the Smithsonian, which came out in the late 1800s. We acquired copies and we searched through them, and we found 17 accounts of between 7 and 8 foot tall skeletons unearthed, excavated, measured and reported by Smithsonian scientists. And then by 1910 they were trying to claim it never happened. And so we have a real issue here. We have numerous other accounts of very tall and non-measured skeletons and bones as well. We even have accounts of double rows and triple rows of teeth based upon the discoveries in Florida. One example is Anna in Union County, Illinois in 1873, and this was recorded by T.M. Perrin. We feature it in our Anatomic Anomalies chapter and talk about a giant skull. The skull was very large but fell to pieces on being exposed to the air. One skull was found that would have measured 36 inches in circumference, which is almost twice the circumference of a normal human skull. And this area here is where many of these accounts were reported from. So we have the 30-inch circumference skull. This is just a graphic we put together for the TV show. But Many others were found, not just this one. We feature this, we actually have a giant skull section in that chapter. Just to give you an example, they go up to 40-inch circumference, and one of them was even found by our good friend Ales Hadlička. This is actually the account from an illustration of the excavation on Amelia Island, which was again reported by the Smithsonian. Not only describes double rows of teeth, but it describes a third row of teeth from a skeleton that was over 7 feet tall. We have the Beehive Stone Mounds, which were reported in 1890-91 in Patterson, North Carolina. This featured in the Smithsonian accounts. Again, it was over 7 foot tall skeleton was found within this mound, which had stone constructions within it, which is quite unusual. In 1910, Skull Given Museum, archaeologist presents Indian relic to Smithsonian. A certain Captain Newton H. Chittenden, who was a famous ethnologist, archaeologist and explorer, who was really also a thief of Indian skulls from graveyards. He spent 20 years devoted to his research, focused on accuracy in history. And he was one of the first people to explore the Queen Charlotte Islands. And when he was there, one of the things he did was actually acquire or steal a skull from a local Indian graveyard. And it was of great interest to European anthropologists who examined it. It was a long treasured, it was a priceless possession. And there's also stories of him uncovering another 8-foot giant in West Berkeley, California. And he believed that this skull was so large that eventually he got taken by the Smithsonian, never to be seen again. And it was actually reported in an accession card, which we feature in the book. We have giant axes again. This is from Charleston, West Virginia. And this is Professor P.W. Norris of the Smithsonian, who describes unearthing a 7 foot 8-inch skeleton. And then there were giant axes reported later. But the problem with the Smithsonian and their agendas is that there was issues, there was agendas, there was changes going on in the way we saw the world. Science was emerging, there was evolution theory was coming forth, there was manifest destiny. This amazing, the amazing white man taking over the savages' land and things like this. And all these combined to create this kind of almost like a racist agenda to destroy and remove the Native Americans from their land. And so when they kept finding these giant skulls, these immense powerful skeletons, this sophisticated technologies, astronomically and geometrically aligned mounds, it didn't fit with the theories that they were pushing forward. And this is summarized by the brilliant J. Edgar Smoot, who's written a book about these issues in North America at the time. This guy, in 1910, Ales Hadlička, was probably the worst person we could imagine taking over an academic historical institution. He became the curator of the Division of Physical Anthropology. He was involved in the eugenics movement, a pre-Nazi philosophy founded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And he kind of wanted to remove the idea that giants existed. And in 1934, in the Berkeley Gazette, he announced, "Giants are no more," declares Hadlička. And he believed they were all, the people weren't measuring things properly. They didn't know what they were doing when they were finding them. They were mismeasurements. The skeletons had sort of expanded under the weight of the earth and things like this. But the problem is, giants kept being found even after he announced this. And this is this is an example from 1936, but they really just kept coming back to haunt him. This is Dr. Preston Holder, and he was doing some reports in Georgia, and he couldn't believe it. Then he was finding 7 to 8 foot tall giants. And even the Smithsonian sponsored the work of Dr. Preston Holder, and Dr. F. Seltzer of the United States National Museum was dispatched to the scene, and none other than Ales Hadlička examined some of the first skulls unearthed, and they were described as sterny and brawny and describing the massiveness of this skeletal structure. The problem was, this kind of got closed down pretty quickly, and that was the end of that story. We also have, and again in 1936, again, Hadlička was involved in this discovery of a 36-inch circumference skull. I believe it's 36. It doesn't give the exact circumference, but a very, very large skull found on the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. And it even talks about, it's even actually officially on one of the accession cards of the Smithsonian, remarks, male adult, very large, capacity around 2000 cc. So the 12th annual report is probably the mecca for giantologists. Numerous accounts in here between 7 and 8 feet tall, too many to mention in this brief lecture, but we go into details in the book, and you can actually buy these actual books yourself if you want to check out the original sources. We also have these handwritten notes of Professor P.W. Norris of the Smithsonian, who was doing some research in the Great Smith Mound in West Virginia, and amazingly he made handwritten notes. If you read these carefully, which we write that we've typed them all out in the book, they describe giant skeletons and giant skulls and bones and teeth and other such things. And he was just making his notes as excavations were being made. So to have these handwritten notes are very, very important and give a clue into what was really being discovered back in ancient North America. Again, we have more accession cards of the Smithsonian. Dimensions giant. I think that says it all, really. And we have numerous academics that are featured in these books, not that one, that talk about skeletal finds. We have Dr. Walter B. Jones, 7'6", Forrest Clements, head of anthropology, Oklahoma. Dr. A. Cadzo of Cambridge University, 7'5" skeletons found in Pittsburgh. Byron Cummings, who was involved in the discoveries in Sonora and other places. Thomas Wilson of the Smithsonian, 8-foot skeleton with massive jawbone, and so on and so forth. So we're finding that these very important academics, these doctors, these professors, were involved in the discoveries of these accounts, these giant bones and skeletons. But one of the areas that I've personally become fascinated with and I've been researching, and I've travelled here a few months ago, and I'm going to be going back there this year, is the area around Nevada, specifically Lovelock Cave and Winnemucca Lake and so forth. Very interesting stories associated with this, lots of myths. Very early date talk about this race of red-haired cannibals called the Saiti-Ka, or thigh or tool eaters, who used to harass the local Paiute Indians in the area. This was spoken about and written about by Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins and her father, who was a chief of the different tribes in the area. One of the earliest accounts of actual discoveries was the discovery of an over 11-foot giant found in the Winnemucca area. We'll come on to Winnemucca soon, but it's believed the whole area was called Winnemucca, around Winnemucca Lake at that time. In 1911, almost 7-foot skeletons were also unearthed when the caves were being dug for guano. This is me sitting at the entrance to the famous Lovelock Cave, where many of these accounts stemmed from. Now, the myths and the legends and the stories written by the Paiute, Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, came out in the late 1800s, but it wasn't until 1911 that this cave was properly investigated, because they were looking for bat guano. But when they started digging all this bat guano, which they would then sell, they kept finding all these artifacts, and they eventually found something like 10,000 artifacts in this particular cave next to this dry lake bed. And this is just a zoom out I took with the drone when I was up there, and no one visits here. I mean, I was there on my own for like 4 or 5 hours, so it's a very, very strange, interesting place to visit. Here are some accounts of some of the so-called skulls that were found, and one of the stories which is really intriguing to me is that they got so tired of these red-haired cannibals, and who were potentially giants, harassing them. They chased them into Lovelock Cave, burnt them out, and sort of fired arrows at them as they tried to escape. So skeletons were being found in Lovelock Cave hundreds or thousands of years later in the early 1900s. And this is where giant skeletons, giant reed kind of slippers or boots were discovered. They also, the giant cannibals used to actually make very interesting duck decoys, which they would use on the lake which was at the base of the cave. But one of the interesting discoveries that I made was actually on display in one of the major museums in Nevada, where they have some of the, there's been stories about 15-inch sandals that were worn by the so-called giants of this area. And when I went to this museum, I couldn't believe it. There was actually evidence. This one was found in Winnemucca, this one was found in Lovelock Cave. These are about size 10. But this one here is a whole different thing. This is something like 17 inches long. So this would have been a size 29, apparently. This is the size that they gave in the information board here. So that would have been someone around 9 or 10 feet tall, at least. And so this, to me, is one of the smoking gun pieces of evidence of giants really existing in this area. Again, we have giant pestle and mortars, which are just hugely oversized. And the whole landscape itself is very, very interesting. There's a very interesting story as well, that the Fallon Fraternal Society acquired one of the giant mummies. And we must remember, some of these giants that were found were mummified. So whether this was a process that they used or whether they just dried out in the dry heat there, we're not too sure. But this, I actually went to this area because and knocked on their door to find out some information, because the story goes that they acquired a very tall giant skeleton or mummy. They boiled it down to have the bones. They were on display and used in rituals by these particular people. Unfortunately, no one was there when I went there, but I guarantee, I'm sure they've got something on display that could prove once and for all something was going on. Here's a photo of the Winnemucca petroglyphs. These are around the area of Winnemucca Lake, north of Lovelock, and these are giant petroglyphs carved into solid tufa rock. There's hundreds of these all around this whole area here. And the thing about these is that not only are they giant-sized, but they're 14,800 years old, potentially. There's a date range between something like 10,800 and 14,800 years old. And if that's the case, these are the oldest petroglyphs in North America, some of the oldest in the world. The thing is, they're huge, they're very high up, and they're thought to be built or carved by giants. Now, there's some research done by J.J. Ainsworth, who's compared some of the carvings here to sites in Ireland, around the Boyne Valley area, which absolutely fascinated me when she showed me this, because we have almost identical carvings between an area in Ireland, which is known for the Fomorian and Firbolg giants, and an area in North America, which is known for the giant red-haired cannibals. Very similar descriptions of the giants who were existing in these areas, but also of the same types of carvings. And even when I was there in the landscape there, I managed to something very strange I discovered with my drone. This incredibly bizarre, almost like a geoglyph, like a multiple concentric spiraling stone circles coming out from the center within the landscape, just at the base of the Winnemucca petroglyphs, which I'd never seen reported anywhere before. No idea what these are. I'm going to go and investigate these when I head back there later this year. This area is also Pyramid Lake, and so we know that there's stories and legends of giants roaming this particular area. And this is actually called the Great Mother, and this is the stone pyramid, which is a natural formation. But all around this area we have super ancient discoveries of human beings existing, and this is the time really that the megafauna were existing in this part of the world. And the reason this is important is because we know that they were existing at the same time. There's legends and there's stories, and there's even now skeletal remains which match that era, talking about these giants over 12,000 years ago. There are various accounts that were put together by Vine Deloria Jr. He collected these oral histories and stories all over North America, describing what was going on here. And one of the things he kept coming across was this idea that a great cataclysm had taken place, like the Younger Dryas, which is now thought to be wiped out, or just, certainly shrunk the megafauna over generations. And also at that time, it shrunk some of the human beings. But still, before that time, giants were coexisted, and there's stories about giant beavers battling giant humans. There's one story about certain individuals or giants herding mammoths like we herd cattle, and we feature these all in the book, in the Legends of the Tall Ones chapter. And I find this personally, I find this particularly fascinating because the origins of the giants in North America is quite an astonishing story in its own right. And in the next lecture, I'm going to go into the origin stories of these particular giants, because more research has been done with DNA linking, especially around the area of the Great Lakes and heading south from there, that there's evidence linking it with the Denisovans of Siberia. We also have Cro-Magnon man who appeared to be in North America at a very early date. And we have evidence coming up from the south as well, suggesting extremely early migrations moving around in and out of the American continent. Which could give some indication of where these giant genes originally came from. So whether it's the Cro-Magnon, Homo heidelbergensis, who are existing in South Africa and Europe over 100,000 years ago, the Denisovans from 40,000+ years ago in Siberia, there seems to be a very interesting story starting to emerge about the origins of the tall ones in native North America. But you can't take it all too seriously. We are talking about giants after all. But in another lecture I'm doing in this series, I'm going to go into the global story of the ancient giants and look at the Denisovans and look at the true origins of where the giant people of North America really came from. So thank you very much for listening.